Thanks, Prescott. It's a pleasure to be here at Sparks, and I value the mix of perspectives that we've had already in the last 2 days. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what could be called dog cognition. And I would say that's a phrase that wasn't really uttered 20 years ago in academic research, and it's now a veritable academic field. Most contemporary research comes from comparative psychology on one side and ethology on the other side, and they've both gone a long way to describing the capabilities, the capacities of man's best friend. Still, notably, this research subject is unique among comparative psychology research subjects. They have worked their way into, 75 million US homes. And it seems to me that researchers should be concerned with elucidating the experience of the dog in a way useful to those living with dogs. So today I'm going to try to describe some of my research which tries to do some of that. It has two complementary components. In one arm of the research, we look at the attributions that we, owners and scientists as well, commonly make of dogs and test whether they're justified. And also, I'll talk a little bit about what prompts us to make these anthropomorphisms, in my view. And this speaks, of course, to a potentially broader, interesting question, which is, are we treating dogs as well as we could? And second, I'm using some information about the biology and the cognition and the sensory experience of dogs to form a picture of my real interest, which is the dog's point of view. And this is, by the way, the photo of a Seattle photographer, dog photographer, Aaron Vey. And I work at the Dog Cognition Lab in Barnard in New York City, and I'll talk about the research of our lab today. Our stories here this weekend are of dogs viewed scientifically, but for a moment I think it's useful to consider how we've thought about dogs over the years, and dogs' representation in art is one way to do that. And Clive started us off nicely yesterday and on Friday with that. And what I think is particularly interesting is that our contemporary view of dogs as the companion who not only is always by our side, but is sporting sweaters or who sleeps in our bed and so forth, is quite contemporary. For early representations of art, as you saw on the stone walls, and here on the Bayeux tapestry from the 11th century, show dogs behaving in their roles as guards or as retrievers of game, etc. And interestingly, to me, in these early portraits, the ancient portraits, and then 11th century, 12th century, 13th century representations, they're kind of on the side of the shot. In other words, they're not the center of the image. At some point, that begins to change. They begin sneaking into domestic and street scenes. Here is a Rembrandt from the next year. You'll see that a dog has appeared in the scene in a kind of nice bit of naturalism in an excretal posture there. And dogs, too, are popping up by people's sides. Here's a Titian of Venus with a Cupid and a lute player, or in another representation, a little dog. Not long thereafter, in the 18th century, they trotted from the side of the canvas to be featured with us centrally, often as objects of fancy. And in the most contemporary representations, we're even out of the picture. The dog is the portrayed, the representative, the individual. And so I feel like this is a very interesting evolution of the dog, and it describes to us what's been a pretty recent contemporary view of the dog as individual, which is in some ways useful for them, productive for them, but also has been a little bit of trouble for us in their representation in science for one good reason. While the dogs are exceptional among the non-human animals in reading the human animal, we don't spend a lot of time reading our dog's behavior. For the most part, whether we're experienced owners or not, we anthropomorphize. We use human attributions to describe non-human animals, and dogs are highly subject to this. We assume that they feel what we do precisely, and wants what we want. We see their behavior as mapping to our behavior. To me, as a scientist, this is an empirical question. It is something that we should investigate, not just start out knowing about. So for instance, we assume that a lick of the mouth, which we call a kiss, is in fact affectionate in just the way that a kiss is, or for instance, that because we don't like getting wet in the rain, a dog also might not like getting wet in the rain. And in both cases, the natural behavior of their close relative, the wolf, is something that might tell us otherwise, and I'll return to that later. But first, some might say, why does it matter if we anthropomorphize? I mean, after all, we do have a very successful relationship with the dogs. The dogs are productive and living among us happily and in many cases to old age. So what does it matter if we assume that we know what they're feeling or knowing? And I will say there are two reasons why I think it matters if we anthropomorphize. First, because sometimes it has incredible consequences. When we assume, for instance, that animals are operating with the same understanding as humans have, for instance, that they understand right or wrong. In much of Europe, from the Middle Ages through about the 18th century, anthropomorphisms like this had an extraordinary result. Animals were held accountable for their actions. In particular, animals were tried and punished, often by death, for all manner of infractions against and trespasses against humans, for perceived understanding of rules that they violated. This was thievery, felonious intent, murder. In 1519, for instance, criminal proceedings were brought against field mice and moles for digging into and burrowing up a field so that neither grass nor green thing could grow, the trial document said. The judge, for these were always seen before a jury or a judge, banished the mice from the field, although he gave them a 14-day reprieve so that the young could grow up. This is a pig being tried at a tribunal for pushing over and killing a child. In most cases, as I say, these animals were not only tried, but then they were convicted and often executed in a public forum. This kind of perversion of the impulse to anthropomorphize isn't entirely in our distant past. This is an image of the circus elephant Topsy, who in 1903 was famously electrocuted in a gruesome fashion as punishment for killing a number of her abusive trainers. In fact, in this, they call it murder. I don't think we're as far from those animals' trials as we think. In fact, one could make the case that when faced with pet dogs who are labeled aggressive or aggressors, and in fact have been aggressive, we do one step worse than the medieval trials. We just kill them outright. And we don't bother to have a trial at all. The second reason I think we should care about anthropomorphisms is because we do this. Dogs are not fresh fruit. This is just wrong, it seems to me. An incredible representation. I'm not going to make the claim that the decision about whether to put an animal in a French fries costume is a serious issue per se, although, to be sure, I have very serious opinions about it. But I do think that assuming that animals can understand right and wrong the way that we do, just like we do, or that they enjoy being costumed because we enjoy putting them in costumes, reflects a kind of laxity in thinking about the animal's experience. That is a serious issue. Increasingly, our sense of the value of an animal and of the rights of that animal are based on an understanding of the animal's cognitive capacities. And anthropomorphisms are, at best, unproven assertions about the cognitive capacities of, in this case, dogs. At worst, they are a wild misrepresentation. So that's why I look at anthropomorphism specifically. And today I want to talk about attributions of emotions to animals. Of course, attributing emotions to non-human animals, including dogs, has long provenance, including Darwin, who you may or may not know, wrote an entire volume, a very readable volume, called The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, to attributing plenty of emotions to non-human animals. He variously calls dogs magnanimous, shameful, modest, sensible, proud. This has a long and storied history. And it didn't take me long on Flickr, for instance, to find plenty of more recent examples of our attributing emotions to dogs based on, in this case, physical features or behaviors. These dogs were tagged as grieving, these as proud. And in fact, I think it's hard not to see these dogs as possibly happy. Now, I think that all scientists, based on the neuroscience of mammalian neuroscience, attribute primary emotions to non-human animals. I don't think that's in question. But I'm interested in particular in these attributions of secondary emotions, and this research of a number of years ago was a questionnaire that asked owners of dogs or cats, and here I've just taken out the dog data, whether they thought their dog experienced these various emotions. And in fact, dog owners roundly do feel that their dogs experience grief, shame, pride, and in particular, I'm going to focus on the latter two. 74% of owners believe that their dogs experience guilt, and 81% think they experience jealousy, and I'll talk about a slightly related, although that's arguable, we can argue about it, topic. So it's starting with guilt. I love this cartoon, actually. Yeah, I used to be a fact checker, and this is the type of thing where I would say, well, you know, dogs haven't passed the mirror mark test, so maybe, but at any rate, but it gives the point, we all recognize that we think of dogs as having an understanding. Most owners think of dogs as having an understanding of their own misdeeds. And I got interested in studying this after this spectacular case in 2006 in the UK when a Doberman named Barney was perhaps unwisely put in charge of a $900,000 teddy bear collection overnight, including Elvis's teddy bear, Mabel. And this was the scene they found in the morning. He had methodically, ruthlessly disemboweled these bears. This was from the press report, heads pulled off, arms, legs here and there. It was a total carnage. One of the officers who arrived on the scene said there was stuffing, fluff, and bear bits everywhere. But some said he looked contrite. And as a researcher of behavior, that's interesting to me. We can look for cues in his outward appearance, and that's what owners usually do, and then investigate that attribution to mind. And so a few years ago, I started looking at what those outward behaviors could be. In this case, Barney had downcast ears and averted gaze. And so my question was, what are all the guilty-looking behaviors that people use to assume they understand their dog's understanding, and can we test their appearance? So what we did, I set up an experiment where we recruited dog owners. We went to their homes and we asked the dog owners to put a yummy treat about a foot in front of their dogs and ask them not to eat it. And then they left the room. The experimenters and a video camera stayed inside the room, and essentially two things happened. The dog was obedient, they refrained from eating the treat, or the dog was disobedient and ate the treat. And this is where the subconditions came in. We asked the owners to come back in the room, and if the dog had been obedient, we said so, and we told the owner to greet the dog as they ordinarily would, and they gave them a happy greeting. And if the dog had been disobedient, we asked them to scold their dog, and the dog owners all did this, and be assured it was always very much a stern, no, Barney, nothing more violent than that. So sometimes the appropriate did happen, where the dog was obedient and was greeted by their owners, and sometimes, or was disobedient and was scolded. But it's a psychology experiment. Sometimes we deceive the owners. So we misled them, and when the dog had been disobedient, we told the owners, oh, no, your dog didn't eat the treat. And so the dog was greeted as usual. And in other cases where the dog had been obedient, we told them that they had eaten the treat. And so they were scolded as though they had. And what we were looking for, we videotaped the whole affair, was the degree of these behaviors associated with the guilty look that appeared in all the cases. And this, I had pulled these from owner's report and from other scientific accounts, included avert gaze, rolling over on their back, giving a paw, dropping the tail, a low wag between the legs, retreating, etc. Here's what some of these look like: rolling over to show the belly, ears down, averting gaze. I always get an awe somewhere in there, yeah. And I want to show you a little bit of what this looked like. This is actually a recreation later on by my lab manager, Julie Hecht.
Leave it, leave it, leave it.
Come back in, she ate it.
What did you do? What did you do?
What we found is that guilt did not change the rate of the guilty look. In other words, the rate of the display of this look was the same whether the dog had eaten the treat or not. But as you saw there, owner behavior did change the rate of the guilty look. What we saw was that the guilty look was displayed much more when the owners started to or in fact scolded their dogs than not. And this is what this looks like. So this was the rate of these behaviors associated with the guilty look, and the only significant difference was between when the owners scolded them or greeted them. They didn't seem to demonstrate differently whether they had been obedient or disobedient. And the subjects, this was an interesting thing that could be followed up. The subjects looked the most guilty when they were not guilty but punished. So interestingly, in the case where they had really done nothing wrong but were punished as though they had. And my thoughts on this are really that this look, which we call the guilty look, and which leads us to the attribution of guilt to the dog, is really just an appeasement behavior, right? You will recognize a lot of these behaviors from other contexts. We could call them submissive behaviors. They're ones designed to avoid punishment because they look so cute. And I think they're very successful in that way. In fact, there's some good evidence that they're learned. Dogs who had been in obedience classes in our group showed more rates of guilty expressions in every condition. In other words, when they'd been in a context where they might have to repeatedly demonstrate this appeasement behavior to the owners. Julie Hecht, then working with Adam and Marta Gacci, who has now joined my lab and runs my lab, continued this research and further showed, predicting one of the complaints about this work, that owners could tell the difference of their dog's display when they returned. She found that owners couldn't tell the difference or guessed at rates of chance whether their dog had in fact eaten the treat or not if they weren't told by the experimenter. Okay, so the next anthropomorphism that I tested was actually an attribution related to that of jealousy, because I hadn't found a way, and I still haven't found a good way to test what the behaviors are that owners think leads them to say, yeah, my dog feels jealous. But it often has to do with an unfair distribution of attention or resources. So in other words, a sense of fairness. I'm spending a lot of time petting this other dog. My dog is jealous, and I can see it in his behaviors as response. So I did a study testing a dog's sense of fairness. And this is called inequity inversion in other comparative psychology contexts, and it's been done with a lot of different primates. And our protocol was really asking if dogs could distinguish a fair condition from an unfair condition. And so what we did is create a social condition where a subject and a control dog. In this case, the control is black and the subject is the white dog, learned about two different, I call them trainers, but they really didn't train the dog to do anything. Trainers who asked the dogs to sit, showed them food, and then gave them food for sitting. The trainers were distinguished by one characteristic, at least the characteristic that was salient to the experimenters, which was whether they were being fair or unfair to the dogs. There were two types of unfair trainers. So the fair trainer always gives one treat to each dog for this sitting behavior. The unfair trainer still gives one treat to the subject. The subject's always going to get one treat. And the important thing here is that the fairness isn't that they've gotten less than they did in the fair condition. The unfairness isn't that they've gotten less than they did in the fair condition, but that they're getting less or more than the control dog. So in the over-reward unfair condition, the subject got one and the control got three all of a sudden. In an under-reward condition, the subject got one and the control got nothing. So we paired fair against over-reward and fair against under-reward. And then the test was, after they'd been familiarized with the trainers, the control dog was taken out and the subject just got to choose with whom to affiliate. Both trainers seemed to have a plate of food in front of them. Who did they approach? So this is what the context looked like. Here are two dogs seeing a fair trainer. Here are two dogs seeing an unfair trainer. And I just wanted to give a little example of what this looked like so you can see that the control, or the subject here, who is the brown and white dog, is really looking at, they see what the other dog is getting. In that case, the subject chose the fair trainer, the other trainer. And this is what we found. In that under-reward versus fair comparison, we found that dogs chose randomly between the fair trainer and the one who had actually given them more than the other dog. So in that under-reward condition, the other dog got nothing. In the over-reward versus fair condition, the dogs chose the trainer who had treated them unfairly. In other words, the other dog, the control dog, got 3 times as much as they did. If dogs have a sense of fairness, and this leads to their jealous-like behaviors, that's very surprising. Because the other dog's getting all that food, it's an unfair situation to the subject. Here, my analysis of this kind of result is that dogs preferred to associate with a trainer who had treated them unfairly because that trainer also had another important characteristic to the dogs. They had so much more food. In every condition, they had 4 times as much food as the fair trainer. And so, they're choosing unfair over fair. But it's for a reason that's different than the attribution we put on the dog. So these are a couple of ways we've started to test these anthropomorphisms of emotions. And my idea is not to undermine the attributions we make. It's just to experiment with the context in which these behaviors occur and say, are we making the correct assessment of what the dog's internal experience would be? Another aspect of our research that I just want to mention for a second is that we're interested also in why we are making these attributions. And Lorenz has been mentioned. He observed famously that young humans have what he called das Kinderschema. I'm not a German speaker, excuse me. We would call it a babiness aspect to them, which might help promote an older human's interest in taking care of these younger humans. So that includes a big head relative to the body, a large forehead, large eyes, rounded cheeks, rounded body shape and extremities. And he noticed that many young animals also have these physical characteristics, and so do dogs often. even as adults. So this has actually stood up for a long time as a possible explanation for why we're interested in and we prefer dogs over some other animals, as they have what's called a neotenous expression into adulthood. And it's certainly, Lorenz thought it was responsible for our nurturing feelings toward our young, and presumably also toward dogs. So our lab recently tested these theories, including Lorenz and some other theories, about what might cause these nurturing feelings, or the way we played it out was what might cause our feelings of preference physically for some faces, some combination of features over others. And so we asked, and this is in some ways connected with a study that Clive described yesterday about what is behind that cuteness. So we asked 124 human subjects, here we're testing humans, to view computer images, and they were 80 pairs of pictures of mixed breed adult dogs, which images we manipulated somewhat so that they always differed by, in many cases it was size, by 15% of one feature. The nares, the nostril size, the eye size, the ear size. In some cases, it was things like the symmetry of features, or the coloration, or the size of a paw. So the subjects saw both the images for a few seconds, often not enough time to really tell what the difference was between the images, and therefore this was a kind of implicit preference test, testing whether we would prefer some features over others. And this is the type of thing that they saw. So that pair of images at the top, just take a second and see if there's one you prefer. And at the bottom, this is what the subjects preferred. And in this case, this dog had larger eyes, and this dog had the face, the mouth manipulated to make it look slightly like a smile. Here too. Do you have a feeling of preference on the top and the bottom? Because in many cases our subjects did, and they preferred this image on the left, which had visible irises over dark irises, which blend in with the pupil, and this dog on the right, which had a larger space between their eyes. Again here, as you can see, that's really hard to tell a difference between them. So we don't think that people were seeing that difference and judging based on a preconceived notion about what should be the cuter thing. But if they were able to make a preference statement over time, we should see that the features kind of fall out that they're preferring. In this case, it was the one on the right, who had larger eyes again, and the one on the left, who had a more predominant brain capsule or forehead. This is a very large chart showing our results, and I'm just going to focus on the first two sort of categories or theories of why we might have preferences for some features over others that we tested. And there were 14 modified features, and the first one we tested was this infantile look, that Lorenz babiness, das Kinderschema look. And what we saw is that some but not all of his features evoked preferences. So the darker lines are the ones where people showed a significant preference for one of the images over the other. In some cases they didn't. Eyes, most often shows larger eyes. It actually chose smaller jowls, which is maybe a little bit what would be counterindicated by Lorenz's theory, because that might be a kind of cheek. And they preferred a larger space between the eyes, which might be a place that would accommodate a large brain capsule. But they didn't have preference for larger paws. And they didn't have preference for a larger top of the head, or what's called the cranial vault, that infants also have. We also tested the theory that Mark Beckhoff and I had proposed a number of years ago, that one prompt to anthropomorphizing animal might be that they have human-like features in some ways. And that was tested by creating visible irises, which people preferred, and by creating a mouth which formed into a smile, which people also preferred. So this is the beginning of my attempt to parse our own behavior, essentially. and say, well, not only is our attribution making appropriate, is it supported by a real understanding of the context of the dog's behavior, but also why are we doing it? And this might be useful for humanitarian purposes, it seems to me, if we are trying to make animals into an image which invokes, for instance, empathy. So, to get back to, though, the complement of my interest in anthropomorphisms, instead, my interest is to really understand what the dog's point of view is. And I think to do that, we really have to understand what makes the dog. And so I'm going to briefly revisit some of the important elements that have been discussed lightly or heavily over the last days: the story of domestication, evidence of the dog's social cognition, and also the sensory experience of the dog. But for instance, I think when we look at how dogs look at each other, every one of us should be starting our presentations with something more like this than the very frontal view of the dog, which is so common, because this is the dog's view of an interest in other dogs, and that tells us a lot about who this creature is. Sometimes when I'm thinking about how to get people to look at dogs as though they were unknown, I say, well, sometimes you could imagine that your dog is an alien creature who has just landed in your home. And if you look at that animal as a strange animal in your house, maybe we can begin to really see their behavior for what it is. And I think that's going to be a beginning of starting to get some perspective of the dog's point of view, or their Umwelt. So I won't go deeply into the story of domestication again, because that has been gone deeply into many times before. But certainly what a dog is not straightforward. They're not furry people. They're not quite wolves. We know that they're probably descended from a common ancestor they share with wolves. That the beginnings of I'm so glad to be able to bring up this slide yet again. And I don't even have to say anything about it. I can just say, and there's that slide. All we know is that many thousands of years ago, this domestication process started. And whatever the date, their role in our life has evolved, but there's something that's been constant for millennia. I love this image of a dog buried in Pompeii 2,000 years ago when Mount Vesuvius erupted and every bit of the lifestyle was frozen in a moment. I mean, I think that's a very familiar posture of a dog, and they're even wearing a pretty hardy collar there. So the important thing here about the domestication story from my interest in the point of view of the animal is just that sometimes we can look to our understanding of wolf behavior to get a clue as to the origin and meaning of dog behavior. So if we revisit, for instance, the dog's kisses, right, the behavior looks very different if you look at wolf kissing behavior. Of course, when wolves return, wolf biologists tell us, when wolves return to the pack after hunting, they are mobbed by the other members of the pack, their family, who all kiss them around the mouth, essentially. And surely it is a greeting. That's not inappropriate to say, but also it causes the hunter to regurgitate some of the hunt. So they all get something to eat. So is your dog actually asking you for a bit of whatever, that pizza that you ate when you return home? Well, I don't think they would be entirely displeased if you gave them a little bit. Suddenly, a familiar behavior looks unfamiliar. Again, we see, I think it's not hard to see a little bit of discomfort in that dog's face. And think about the standover in wolf packs, a kind of scolding of a dominant animal, or putting in a place over another animal, which leads to some pressure of the body of one animal over another. It seems to me not at all unlikely that the pressure of a raincoat on the back would in some way reproduce or re-invoke that vestigial feeling of being scolded by somebody else. And if you ever see your dog freeze in place when putting the raincoat on, that would be the behavior we would expect the animals on the bottom to display there. So that's part of how we could reconsider the behavior of the animals. Relatedly, if I hark back to Ray and Lorna's story of domestication, their hypothesis, it also tells us something about who the dog is. There was a new ecological niche. Humans were less nomadic. They were creating settlements. They created waste. There was some self-selection by whoever this proto-wolf was, where they scavenged maybe more than other relatives did. And then, obviously, much thereafter, of artificial selection by humans, based on human preference for behaviors and traits, as we've talked about. And this has been tested, of course, by being partially reproduced by Belyaev, as has also been discussed. And the result now, as Adam has said, is that the natural environment for dogs is around us. So that's very important, too. They're not wolves entirely. We shouldn't reduce their behavior entirely to analogies with wolf behavior. We are their kind of extended conspecific families. And we could say we are their pack, but if packs are families, they are just part of they must consider themselves part of our families if they're exposed to us early enough. And I think that's important. Almost all of my research takes place with the owners, and often in a context that the dog is familiar with, as opposed to in a removed laboratory context, to try to invoke that natural environment. My early research was all about looking at dogs interacting with other dogs, without any attempts, classic ethological work to impose anything on their behavior. And that domestication developed an ability of dogs that is kind of the second thing that I think we need to know, which is that their social cognitive abilities are scaffolded upon their interest in looking at us, watching us, looking us in the eyes. And this eye contact between dogs and humans, that's surprising. It's extremely rare to have animals who look us in the eyes, not as a threat, but in seemingly that communicative and potentially intimate or affiliative way that dogs do. That leads to all sorts of social cognitive specialties by the dog. And I'm just going to briefly allude to some work, Adam's work and others. For instance, this was impressive and surprising. Because they're looking at us, then they suddenly succeed at these tasks that other non-human primates did not. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, but they succeeded at all of these, but elbow cross-pointing, knowing which of the two buckets is baited by looking at the pointing of the body or pointing of an arm extended from the body. And I think elbow cross-pointing is really actually very difficult. I'm not sure what that means. And dogs are maybe not as well. And furthermore, this looking at us leads to some appreciation potentially of our attention. I find this particularly provocative because attention is not visible, right? I mean, there are markers of it. A face and eyes are markers of it, but you're all looking at me. Do I have equal attention from all of you? Certainly not, right? But I know about that, and I might use that in trying to encourage communication with you. And dogs seem to understand something about attention, not just superficial markers as well. In this nice study by Call and Brower, and there have been others like this. Again, this was a model where the owner puts something on a treat on the floor, and the dog is told not to eat it. And in this case, they had three conditions, where the owner then sat in the room with their back turned to the dog, facing the dog but with their eyes closed, facing the dog with their eyes open. And what they were looking for here basically was the rate to disobey. In all cases, the dog eventually ate the treat. But they were slowest when the person's eyes were open, and they were quickest when the person's back was turned and they couldn't have attention. So I think that this really, this social cognitive ability of the dog is important in trying to gauge what it is that the dog's experience is like when around us. Their physical cognitive abilities are not so great, but they succeed at some physical cognitive tasks because they use us as the tool to solve those tasks. And that's because they're socially, cognitively so skilled. And of course, the other big component of understanding the dog's point of view, and I'm really fascinated with this, is understanding their nose, because I think it all really begins with the nose. And we see a lot of behavior that tells us this, but for some reason, presumably because our noses are not so good, so we can't really extrapolate into the dog's experience easily, we have mostly ignored the amazing success of the dog's nose in our imaginings of what their experience is. But I think we should change that. I mean, we have 5 million olfactory cells in the nasal epithelium, the lining of our nose, that can receive odorant molecules from the environment. Dogs have somewhere between 200 million and 1 billion cells, depending on the breed. So there's an exponential difference in the olfactory experience that a dog can have compared to humans. I think that's very different than the kind of they're a good smeller that many people understand. And they also have what I like to call a second nose. So this is well known to biologists, but it's surprising for people to learn that not only do they have that nose we all recognize, that beautiful snout, but then in the hard palate in the roof of their mouth, they have a vomeronasal organ, as many mammals do, and in fact there's some debate over whether humans do. And this vomeronasal organ, unfortunately named, is able to receive volatile hormones in the environment. So for instance, a dog might detect efferent cortisol emitted from a person or other dog. I think this should be incorporated into our understanding of what the dog's behavior is, this ability. Dogs even sniff better than we do. And that's a profound thing to imagine about the dog. And by the way, we can notice this even with our gross visual capacity. We can notice dog sniffing behavior. But people happily who have looked even more closely using flow visualization techniques have shown us that the canine nostril is functioning as what they call a variable geometry aerodynamic sampler. And in other words, through flexing the nostril, they can send air to be smelled through one pathway and air to be respired through another pathway. And then when they expire air out the side slits of their nose. This is a very useful trait. When we sniff in and sniff out, what we're basically doing is removing that odorant molecule from our nose. So it stops our sniffing. If you don't want to smell something, you exhale, right? Dogs don't want to stop smelling things. So if they send the exhales out the side slits of their nose, it actually causes a little turbulent, they call them nostril air jet, that lifts up more molecules off the ground to be available for smelling. The result is that they can do extraordinary things. So for instance, if we looked at these footprints, we could get a pretty good guess of which way this person had walked. But what about if they were these footprints? We can't tell, probably, unless you're very good at looking at weight patterns and footprints. But the dog can. And that's because the tracking dog can distinguish between the concentration of odor in the first and fifth footprint. There is different concentrations of odor or different amount of disturbed matter under the footprint that allows them to detect the directionality of the person who's gone. So I think our imagining about the dog's point of view should take into account this kind of sensitivity of the olfactory experience. So I'm going to end with one of our most recent study, which was just published, in which we tried to get a little bit at the umwelt of the pet dog and his smell environment by asking a couple of questions that are kind of like visually based comparative psychological research, but using olfaction. If the dog is olfactory, we might expect that they can distinguish quantity by olfaction alone, because we know that in ordinary circumstances, they distinguish quantities by visual quantities. They'll prefer 5 treats over 1, for instance. And I'm also interested in the pet dog's olfactory environment because we add a lot of smells to their environment. And so we wondered if their preference for more food, for a larger quantity, could be changed if we added a scent to the larger food. So to do this, we allowed dogs held by their owners with their eyes closed, to sniff 2 covered plates that had different quantities of food. And that was 1 or 5, and that's because there had been studies showing that they distinguished between 1 and 5 when seen visually, and preferring the larger. And then we put the plates down a few feet away, and we asked them to choose one. And what we found is that, let me start with approach. We looked at approach behavior, and we found that they approached that larger quantity plate more than the smaller, but actually it's not a significant difference. You know, if they really want 5 little pieces of hot dogs, which they really do want, you would think if they can distinguish which plate had 5, actually, they would approach all the time. In this case, I think it was a nice example of how what the experimenter, namely our ideas of what the measure should be, were not sufficiently sensitive to what the dog's experience of that study might be. Happily, we also looked at plate attention, which was basically, it was a kind of binary score of whether they gave more attention to the larger or smaller plate when it was presented to them for initial investigation. And here we did see a difference. They gave a lot more attention to the larger. So they did seem to be distinguishing these quantities in one way, but by the time we asked them to do the thing we actually thought they should be able to do, they were maybe not interested. We also found that there was a huge owner influence in which plate they preferred. So if this was a kind of quasi-replication of other research, if owners showed enthusiasm for the plate with the smaller quantity, we asked the owners to get up behind the plate with a smaller quantity. They didn't know that that's what it had on it. They were covered. And show a lot of interest in it. Say, oh, so good, so yummy. And the owners did this. It was so nice of them. You know, the dogs go for the one that has that smaller quantity because the owners were interested in it. And when we let them see the quantities, so we exposed them so that they had a visual look that one plate had more hot dog treats than the other treat, but we added a scent to the plate that had more. And in this case, our scents were ordinary scents that they might encounter around the house. It was a dog mint breath spray. That was one. Another was a lavender shampoo intended for dogs. And another was vinegar, which is a common ingredient of household cleaners, which would be spread all over your house. We found that it significantly increased their preference for the smaller quantity. In other words, they didn't always, but often avoided the larger quantity when it had this scent that we thought was at best really neutral and maybe even positive for the dog. In fact, lavender has been implicated in welfare for dogs, but it changed their choice. It changed their olfactory experience. And I think that's my interest in it. Dogs were sniffing out larger quantities, and they avoided more food if accompanied by another odor. And they were always convinced by the owner's show of interest. So whatever their olfactory experience is, it could be trumped by owner direction. And olfaction's influence on behavior might be very short term. So while we saw a difference in their interest in the plates when they were right in front of them, 25 seconds later, when we put the plates down, they no longer were making their decisions on how to behave based on that early investigation. Ultimately, I'm trying to get at this sensory, what Jakob von Uexküll called Umwelt, the worldview, the sensory experience of the dog. And I like to show how we can just all see this in our natural environment in an easy way. This is an entrance to the park where I take my dogs, and I could tell you a lot about this wall. I mean, I know the type of material it is made of, I know where it leads, I know what you can see in the distance, I know what time of year it is by the foliage of the branches. And so my experience of the stairs, I know what type of people I might be encountering on the other side of that corner, is really about seeing all that when I see this wall. Of course, I was interested in what the dogs might experience. So I just stood around for a few minutes with a camera, and this is what you see. The dogs are not experiencing that huge range of things. They are experiencing the one corner of the wall. Well, so reimagine what the dog's experience is like if there are dogs in this room joining us. It is not about any of the things that it is about for us. Reimagine what the dog's experience is like when they're left at home with you. What is the olfactory information that's coming along during the day? Reimagine the experience when they encounter other dogs. And I encourage everyone to start watching the dog in this investigative and almost anthropological way as the dog has been watching us. Thank you.